So today on Sports File, we're taking a second part look at the saga of Roberto Duran. Now, in the first podcast, we talked about his ascension to the lightweight, undisputed lightweight champion of the world, and his consideration for being the best pound-for-pound fighter of the 1970s, where there's very little argument amongst boxing historians. Now, as stood in 1978, he unified the title by knocking off a WBC champion Esteban de Jesus in dramatic faction, a unification fight, to amass his full record of 62-1. Now, Duran gave up the undisputed lightweight championship in February 1979, and everybody that followed boxing, including the great chroniclers like Burt Randolph Sugar and Ring Magazine, pretty well figured a super match was going to appear between Sugar Ray Leonard, the hero of Montreal Olympics, and the welterweight title, and Roberto Duran, who was the unofficial uncrowned champion of the welterweight division, even though he fought only 2 fights in the 147-pound division before that, including a win against former WBC welterweight champion, the ever suave Carlos Perlino, and the top 30 contender Zafrino Speedy Gonzalez. Now, the WBC had decided to have the fight at Olympic Stadium, Montreal, which is kind of ironic because, again, Sugar Ray Leonard had great success at the 76 Summer Olympics. Now, but it gave more momentum. Duran wanted to fight maybe in the west coast of the U.S. or even down in Mexico, but he also got 1/5 the money Leonard was making, despite the fact he was entering the bout with a 71-1 record. Now, the fight itself, I watched that live to tape and I judged that, and Duran, who at the time in June 20th, 1980, was a couple of years past his prime, won the fight, and he captured the WBC welterweight title with a very aggressive offensive and defensive style. Sugar Ray Leonard looked to be a little bit put out by Duran's style. He looked actually out of shape, and at times his defense was terrible. And having the crowd chant Roberto Duran's name from the third round on may have put him off his game, because Leonard was a big egotist like Duran was, and having everybody in that venue take up for his opponent, where allegedly he was the star of the Montreal Olympics with Nadia Comaneci. At the time, title fights were still 15 rounds, and this fight, Duran won the fight on scorecards 145, 144, 148, 147, which would be 3 rounds of 2 with 10 even, and 160, 46, 144. Myself, I had at least 6 of the rounds of the fight even, but in the later rounds, Duran was dominant, and I had Duran winning 7 rounds of 3, so it'll be 147, 143. Now, the brawl in Montreal, as was described, put Duran on top of the world, but a lot of people believe that Leonard didn't show his best fight in the match. And at the time, Duran came up to iconic status in his home country, Panama, and across the world. Leonard initiated his rematch clause and asked for a rematch the following November. And Leonard was a very adaptive fighter. He'd sometimes do bad in the early rounds against a fighter and fight better. And I think he decided to, through his trainer, of course, to change his tactic, using more footwork and movement than he had in the first fight. And in this rematch, the famous no mas fight, Duran was, couldn't do anything to against Leonard, against the ropes. And even though he was slightly held ahead on the scorecards after 7 rounds, Duran in this fight was slightly listless, be it because he might have been drinking or eating too much before the fight, whatever. He just didn't have the stamina compared to the 15-round hot Montreal Olympic Stadium bout that everybody remembers as being sweltering. Now, Leonard won 2 consecutive rounds towards the late rounds of the 8th and 9th, and Leonard started taunting and mocking Duran and doing the old kind of hit me away rope-a-dope. Now, halfway in the 8th round, Duran, for some reason, again stopped fighting and repeatedly saying no more, no mas. And actually, Duran never said he said no mas. He says, I won't go on. Now, this is kind of weird how the media built him up and bore him down. They basically chastised Duran, saying he was a chicken, saying that, a person of his talent should never being able to allowed to quit, like he's the only fighter ever quit. In Canada and the rest of the countries across the world, he never lost any of the strength because, Duran, like any other fighter, could have a bad fight. A lot of great fighters lost, and, Leonard lost to Duran to fight before. He wasn't chastised like that in the media. If anything, you want to see, another in the series. Now, entering the second fight, I think Duran might have been, after the weigh-in, pushing 151 pounds. And I guess he made a decision to move up to the light middleweight division. And in January 30, 1982, against longtime champion, welterweight champion Wilfredo Benitez, he lost a 15-round decision. Now, he continued the fight in the light middleweight division with some success. He had some key losses as well. But the big break, of course, when he decided to sign with promoter Bob Arum and get away from the ever disgusting Don King, and it marked the beginning of a comeback in which he eventually won a big match, which I consider probably the greatest fight in Latino boxing history, when he knocked out the former welterweight champion Pepino Cuevas in a devastating 4-round knockout, which probably ranks as one of the most devastating lighter weight fights you'll ever see. Duran was like a land shark, and Cuevas, who had great punching power, couldn't do anything. And it was so shocking to see Pepino be knocked out after he spent most of the 70s knocking out the top contenders in the division, or dominated them. So now he got a second crack at a light middleweight title because of this, and eventually took on WBA champion Davey Moore, which turned out to be another devastating Duran-style knockout for the uncrowned champ of the middleweight division. It was held at Madison Square Garden on June 16, 1983, which also happened to be Duran's 32nd birthday. And boys, oh boys, Duran brought the birthday bang that fight. Davey Moore entered the fight with some skill. He was 12-0, and he fought strongly in the first 3 rounds. But by the fourth, Duran pretty well figured, he self-published reports, that Moore couldn't really hurt him, and an onslaught began. And it was the most devastating beatings in the division's history. And being inspired by the pro-Duran crowd, Duran relentlessly punished Moore. And by the end of the 6th round, Moore's eye was so badly swollen, he was nearly killed. And by the 7th round, he took the last punishment series. And between the 7th and the 8th, the fight was eventually stopped. Moore was given every credit, but Moore accidentally died in a drive yard accident a couple of years later, and it destroyed Moore's career. And that legacy of Duran regrew because of the win against Moore, and it probably is the top 5 Duran fight compared to the other matches. And let me tell you something, Davey Moore, there was never any dog in that guy. He took everything Duran had to follow. And Duran at light middleweight didn't have the same quality of knockout and devastation at 135, but he still had that devastating accuracy, and that's what killed Moore. Moore was not a mover like Duran was. Now, instead of taking a break after he won the title, Duran decided in November to go for the middleweight title just after winning the light middleweight, and he took on the excellent executor, marvelous Marvin Hagler, in Las Vegas. Now, this fight, Duran stood tall against one of his fellow Four Kings, as we call them, Duran, Hearns, and Hagler. And during the fight, Duran's had a hard time hitting Hagler's bald head. He eventually broke his hand and lost in a very competitive fight that went again another 15 rounds. Although after 12 rounds, 2 of the judges had Duran ahead on points. But of course, Hagler was a strong finisher, and over the final 3 rounds, he got enough 10-9s to earn an unanimous decision. Now, despite the loss, Duran became the second man to take Hagler to the 15-round distance. And of course, everybody knows Vinciano Fermo was the other when Hagler had tried to take Vito's title, and they got to a draw. Now, here's another controversy goes in because Hearns was waiting in the division for the WBC. For the WBC light middleweight title. Duran decided, hey, the best way to fight Hearns and get the money title he wanted. He was eventually stripped of WBA when they didn't approve of his fight against Marvin Hagler. So he entered the fight literally as the WBA uncrowned light middleweight champion because it was stripped. And Hearns at the time, he may have been 156 at weigh-in, but he was probably 170 or 175 by after weigh-in. And when Duran stepped in the ring against Hearns, a guy that had almost a foot more in the reach and devastating inside power, Duran, to many, a lot of people thought it was going to be his last fight, and I kid you not, he thought he was going to get killed. And Duran did make history in the fight, but this time it was for all the worst bad reasons. Now Hearns in the first 40 seconds did a little bit of toe-to-toe with Duran, but then decided after a while that he can move on the inside. And Duran eventually was knocked down twice in the first round, and especially the second knockdown was saved by the bell. And he went to the wrong corner, and you knew that the second round wasn't going to last long. And Duran went down the third time, and when the fight was stopped, Duran's the first time I ever saw such a great fighter fall in his face. And there's an old adage in boxing: when a fighter falls in his face, it's done. Now this bout was named one of the top fights of all time, and it kept kind of Duran away from the title until 1989. But you got to understand this: under the Four Kings concept, from 1980, he fought the 284. He fought Leonard twice, Hagler once. He fought Hearns. He fought Pepino Cuevas. He fought all these top contenders. Wilfredo Benitez, and Davey Moore. I mean, he was very active. Can you imagine a fighter of the modern era, let's say like Pacquiao, fighting title holders in 3 divisions, in 6 or 7 major contenders in 5 years? He could be a billionaire. Duran was fighting for 2 reasons at the time: for pride and money. He had conquered 135. He had conquered kind of 147 by beating Leonard. He conquered light middleweight, and he almost conquered middleweight because a lot of people believed that Thomas Hitman Hearns was the kind of the undisputed middleweight champion of the world. But later on, of course, Duran in '89, the big win against Iran Barkley, when he finally won the middleweight title. He was a contender for the super middleweight different belts. But the fighter, the Duran the fighter in 1984 again was 6 years separated from his prime. And I really think, the wear and tear of fighting fighters who were 10, 15 pounds bigger than he was took away a little bit of his shine. As he was, at the time when he was fighting, he was a top 5 fighter of all time. Now he dropped about 7th or 8th, which is pretty well normal. If you, Thomas Hitman Hearns was a little bit past his prime because he had lost to Leonard prior to the Duran fight. Now Marvin Hagler was kind of weakening by 1983 because his best fights, just like Duran, were in 1970s. Overall, I think the Duran legacy can be broken down in those 2 major factors. Now, for us boxing fans, having Duran in so many tough fights, we really thought, again, after the Hearns fight, that was going to be it. And, he came back. Anybody can come back from a devastating knockout like that and have as many successful fights afterwards. And a lot of, I think it was Nate Lupin, not Levin Lupin, but one of the writers from Ring Magazine said, Duran was more stunned than anything else. It wasn't like a 14-pound knockout. He basically showed some of the weaknesses in Duran's lower chin, because the face of Duran would move all over the place, but sometimes Duran was susceptible to straight shots like Hearns. Hagler didn't really have a chance to knock him out because Hagler didn't have the punching power to kill to kill Duran's style. Leonard was pitter pat. Leonard wasn't a pure knockout artist. So I mean, the Four Kings approach: Hagler, Hearns, Leonard, and Duran. You know, they all fought each other. There was many bouts. Hagler, of course, lost to Leonard in a decision, never fought again. Leonard and Duran had a third fight. Hearns and Leonard had a big legacy. But I mean, Duran, for pound, gave great value because, again, in those fights, he was giving out up. He was overweight in a way. He was 10 pounds over his best weight. Duran best weight about 140, 135 in the weigh-in, about 5 pounds. And he didn't have the trunk space to give the big power. He was based on the short punches, and as you know, with a tall person like Hearns, he couldn't get inside. Leonard was too speedy. Hagler had too much of an aggressive upper body to really do any damage, but you look like a Cuevas and Palomino and Davey Moore, that's where it worked out. And, it would be interesting to see if Duran would have stayed at 140 if there's another great fighter coming up, a super lightweight. It would be an interesting to see what type of fights Duran had. There was no competition at 140, and that's why he moved up. Welterweight, middleweight at the time was marquee, man. There was 70 fighters in those divisions, 35 each, that really, really were world class, and that's what Duran and the Verrett brothers, don't forget it as well. He had a legacy against them as well. So on this great Thursday, where an thunderstorm is coming in New Brunswick, rain or snow, we're not sure. Wish you a great day. And as we like to say in the Roberto Duran universe, keep your hands up, because if Duran finds a spot open, he's going to take you out. Keep punching, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.